All right, so welcome to another video. This week, we're going to take a look at some of the most common cliches that can be found in a stereotypical Hollywood-style horror and kind of suspense cue. We're going to learn a simple template that you can use as a starting point when writing your own unique, scary music. Templates like this one can be really useful for understanding what's commonly associated with this type of music, so that you can make informed decisions about how your own music will either be similar to or different from the established mold. Really quick, I want to thank my wonderful patrons for their support of this channel and for making videos like this one possible. If you would like to show your support for this channel by becoming a patron, purchasing a copy of my book, or signing up for private lessons, the links are in the description of this video. So with that, let's get started. All right, so first things first, let's take a listen to a sample of this template. Here we have a very simple and short cue that I wrote using the same guidelines we'll be covering in this video. So let's give it a quick listen. So there we go. A simple, quintessential, cliche, scary music. Let's take a look at how I wrote it. So at the core of this entire template is the idea that you want to make your audience feel uncomfortable. And one of the simplest ways you can do this is to just take away everything that they take for granted in most music. If we take a look at the tempo and rhythmic qualities of this kind of music, we'll see an example of what I'm talking about. You see, most scary music isn't going to have a clear beat or tempo. I mean, it's not exactly something you can tap your foot to. In fact, when I wrote this piece, I didn't even bother setting a specific beat or figuring out a time signature to work with. Instead, I changed the ruler display in Cubase from bars and beats to seconds, which removes the different measures and beat subdivisions from my editor window, and replaced them with a linear display of how many seconds and minutes I was working with. Now, going hand in hand with this idea of not worrying about measures or beats is another common strategy found in this type of music, something called aleatoric performance techniques. Now, this strategy comes from the modernist movement of the 20th century, and specifically refers to an approach where the composers leave some decisions about the music up to the performer themselves. For example, writing a short passage for violin, and then telling each player to perform it as fast as they can, on repeat, without caring if they stay in sync together, or if they even perform the right notes 100% of the time. The whole point of aleatoric music is to focus on creating more of a vibe or a special effect than a strict performance of the written material. Now, a lot of aleatoric techniques can be very difficult to translate into a DAW like Cubase, but it does become easier when you're working with solo instruments. For example, let's look at what I did with the flute. I picked a single note and just simply played it randomly to get the kind of effect I was looking for. I didn't bother to worry about how many notes I was fitting per measure or what specific rhythms I was working with. I just played this note repeatedly on my keyboard to create the general effect that I was going for. The whole point of these strategies is to take away the concept of a reliable beat or rhythm from the music, which goes a very far way into making the listener feel uncomfortable with what they're hearing. Now, with tempo and rhythm taken care of, next let's address how you can use your harmony and melody. And first things first is that melodies are actually really rare for this kind of music. Most people commonly associate music with having some semblance of a melody. So if you just take it away from them, it'll feel all the more unnatural and wrong. So if there is no melody, then your harmony will become all the more important as the primary foreground material of your music. And once again, we'll want to work with something that's off-putting to the audience. For harmony, this typically means we want to use as much dissonance as possible. The easiest way to achieve this is to focus on building your own chords out of intervals that are typically avoided in most consonant harmonies. Namely, you'll want to use a whole bunch of minor second intervals and tritones. Typically, I'd say you should just feel it out when writing these harmonies, but that wouldn't exactly be helpful to everyone. So if you are looking for a more specific strategy, here's a quick and simple one to get you started. First, start out with a very simple bass line. For example, just kind of a simple descending line of notes. Make sure to avoid following any specific tempo or time signature while doing this, possibly using the same strategy I mentioned earlier in your own DAW. Next, add a note a minor second above each note in your bass line. After that, simply add another note, a tritone above that note. Then add one more note, a minor or major second above that. And then finally, you can voice lead the whole thing in just some way or fashion, if you feel like it. This should give you a nice starting point that you can work with and adjust until you're happy with what you have. If you are interested in learning other strategies, including the approach I used for the example in this video, I recommend checking out my video on set theory, which will give you a look at a common type of non-functional harmony used in this genre of music. So with melody and harmony taken care of, the last thing to address is orchestration. Here we're gonna break away from the mold a little bit. There aren't too many specific strategies to make your orchestration sound unnatural to most listeners. So instead, our focus is better spent on 3 specific ideas that can help emphasize the darker nature of the music so far. The first rule of thumb is that the more danger you want in your sound, the larger your instrumentation should be. In other words, the amount of fear you want your music to convey will be directly related to how many instruments you are using at any given point. The second rule of thumb is using brass instruments when you want to strengthen the dissonance in your music, and woodwinds or strings when you want to either reduce it or kind of establish a starting point. And finally, in addition to these 2 ideas, this kind of music will also frequently use sound effects and experimental playing techniques to create new and unsettling sounds. So with that, let's listen to our sample once again, and this time I'll include notes on the screen for how each of the strategies we've discussed so far were put to use to create this cue. So, just to summarize, at the core of this kind of scary music is the idea that we want to make the audience uncomfortable. This can be achieved through a variety of different strategies. The music will rarely ever have a perceptible beat or rhythm. It will also frequently make use of aleatoric or partially random performances on various instruments. Most scary cues won't make use of a melody, but they will focus on having crunchy and dissonant harmonies. And this can be achieved by starting with a bass line first and then just adding dissonant intervals like the minor second and tritone to help create random chords above it. You can also use strategies like set theory to great effect. Finally, orchestration in this kind of music frequently makes use of experimental sounds and playing techniques, while sticking to two primary guidelines. Your instrumentation size should be directly related to the amount of danger or fear that you want to convey, and brass instruments will accentuate dissonance in your music, while woodwinds and strings will have a softer impact. And with that, we have reached the end of another video. Now, templates like this one can be super useful. They provide a starting point so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you need to write a scary theme. However, they are cliché for a reason, and you should never fully rely on a template if you want to write interesting and emotionally rich music. If you are interested in learning an effective approach to writing unique and emotionally expressive music, I recommend checking out my video on the psychology of emotions and music, and or purchasing a copy of my book, The Musical Storyteller, translating story worlds, characters, and emotions into music. Once again, I want to thank my wonderful patrons for their support, as well as all of you who show your support through the many kind and supportive comments, emails, and messages that I receive. I appreciate each and every one of you. So until next time, keep studying, keep working hard, and keep writing new music.